Around 3,300 years ago, Egypt was the strongest state on the face of the earth. Its pharaoh controlled territory stretching from the deserts of Nubia in the south to the borders of Syria in the north. His army fielded thousands of chariots. His temples held more gold than any kingdom of the ancient world. He had already led one of the largest chariot battles ever recorded and lived to sign the first peace treaty in history. He had fathered more than 100 children and built more monuments than any pharaoh before him. Egyptian religion held that he was not merely a king, but a living god, and that Egypt, under his rule, could not be conquered by any outside force. For his entire reign, that belief held. No foreign army conquered Egypt while he sat on the throne. And yet, according to one of the oldest and most influential texts in human history, this same king was made to release an entire population of slaves against his direct orders without a single battle taking place. The man responsible held no weapons, commanded no soldiers, and described himself by his own account as someone who struggled to speak in front of others. His name was Moses. This is not only a story about slavery and freedom, although it is that. It is a story about what happens when a ruler with total military power meets a form of resistance that military power cannot address, and about how much a civilization built to last forever is willing to endure before it finally reverses a decision. Almost everything known about this account comes from a single source: the book of Exodus, the second book of the Hebrew Bible, along with related material in Genesis, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These texts were written and edited over a long period, reaching close to their present form many generations after the events they describe. No surviving Egyptian text from this period mentions Moses, a plague, or the departure of Hebrew slaves. This absence is not necessarily surprising on its own. Egyptian royal inscriptions were composed to record victories and building projects, not defeats or embarrassments, and the loss of an entire labor force would likely have counted as both. The one piece of physical evidence that touches this account at all is a stone slab carved around 1208 BCE under a pharaoh named Merneptah, listing several defeated territories in Canaan. Among them is a name Egyptologists read as Israel, marked in the inscription not as a city or a country, but as a people. It is the earliest confirmed mention of Israel outside the Bible, and it tells us only that a group by that name existed in Canaan by that date. It says nothing about how they arrived there. Everything else in the account that follows rests on the biblical text itself, checked, where possible, against what archaeology and Egyptology can independently confirm about the world it describes. The pharaoh most often connected to this story is Rameses II, who ruled Egypt for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, and is still known to historians as Rameses the Great. He came to the throne at 25 and reigned so long that most Egyptians alive at his death had never known another ruler. Early in his reign, he led an army organized into 4 divisions, each named for a different Egyptian god, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth, into Syria against the Hittite Empire, and fought the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot engagements ever recorded, involving more than 5,000 chariots on both sides. Neither side won outright, but Rameses had the battle carved onto temple walls across Egypt as a personal triumph. Some 15 years later, Egypt and the Hittites signed a treaty ending hostilities permanently, the earliest peace agreement between two states whose full text has survived to the present day. Rameses built a new capital in the eastern Nile Delta, a city called Pi-Rameses, meaning House of Rameses, filled with palaces, temples, and barracks used to stage military campaigns into the Levant. He constructed the rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel, expanded the great temple complex at Karnak, and built a mortuary temple at Thebes that, according to a surviving administrative record, employed close to 50,000 people. He fathered more than 100 children and celebrated more royal jubilee festivals than any king before him. Under his rule, Egypt controlled trade routes reaching from Nubia to the Levant, and its treasury, by every surviving account, was immense. This was the state, and quite possibly the individual king, that a population of enslaved foreign laborers was about to walk away from. According to the book of Exodus, the ancestors of these laborers had lived in Egypt for generations, since a famine centuries earlier had brought the family of a man named Jacob into the country, where his son Joseph held a senior position in the Egyptian government. Over time, their descendants, called the Israelites in the text, grew numerous. Exodus states that a new king came to power who did not know Joseph and who viewed the growing Israelite population inside his borders as a threat, concerned they might side with an invading enemy in the event of war. His response was forced labor. Both Egyptian and biblical evidence indicate that a Semitic-speaking population lived and worked in the eastern Nile Delta throughout this period, in a region the Bible calls Goshen. Exodus states specifically that Hebrew slaves were made to build two store cities for the pharaoh, named Pithom and Rameses. That second name is one of the central pieces of evidence historians use when trying to date these events, since a city built and named for Rameses II would place the beginning of the oppression, at the earliest, during his reign. When forced labor failed to slow the population growth, the text says the king gave a second order, directed specifically at two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. Kill every Hebrew boy at the moment of birth. The two women refused, telling the king that Hebrew women gave birth too quickly for the midwives to intervene. In response, the king issued a broader command. Every Hebrew boy born from that point forward was to be thrown into the Nile. It was into this order that Moses was born, to a Levite couple named Amram and Jochebed. His mother hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer conceal him, she coated a basket made of reeds with pitch, placed the infant inside it, and set it among the reeds at the edge of the Nile, with his sister watching from a distance. The king's own daughter came down to bathe at the river, found the basket, and recognized the child as a Hebrew infant. She decided to raise him regardless. His sister, watching nearby, offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child, and brought the boy's own mother forward for the role. The princess named him Moses, a name the text connects to the Hebrew phrase for drawn out, because she had drawn him from the water. He grew up inside the same royal household that had ordered his people's infant sons killed. As an adult, Exodus records that Moses went out among his own people and saw an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave. He killed the Egyptian, buried the body in the sand, and assumed no one had witnessed it. Within a day, it was known throughout the court. The king moved to have Moses executed, and Moses fled east into the Midian desert. There, at a well, he helped the 7 daughters of a local priest named Reuel, also called Jethro, water their flock against a group of shepherds trying to drive them off. Jethro took him in, and Moses married one of the daughters, Zipporah. For the next 40 years, according to the text, Moses worked as a shepherd in the Midian wilderness. A man who had killed once, fled twice, and appeared to have no further role in the country that had raised him. The turning point came at a mountain called Horeb. Moses saw a bush burning without being consumed, and when he approached it, a voice identified itself as the God of his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and gave him an assignment: return to Egypt and secure the release of the Israelites. Moses objected several times. He asked by what authority he should speak, and was given a name, rendered in Hebrew as a phrase close to "I am that I am." He asked what he should do if the Israelites did not believe him, and was given 2 demonstrations: a staff that could turn into a snake and back, and a hand that could turn diseased and then be restored. He stated plainly that he was not a skilled speaker, describing himself as slow of speech and slow of tongue. In response, he was told that his older brother Aaron would act as his spokesman. A man who had spent 4 decades avoiding the court he was raised in, and who by his own account struggled to speak in front of others, was now being sent to confront the most powerful ruler alive. Moses and Aaron returned to Egypt, gathered the elders of the Israelites, and then went before the king with a direct request: let the Israelites travel 3 days into the wilderness to hold a religious festival. There was no military force behind the request, no bargaining position beyond the demand itself. The king refused, and in response, increased the workload. Israelite slaves making bricks had previously been supplied straw as a binding material. From that point forward, they were told to gather their own straw while still producing the same daily quota of bricks. The Israelite foreman, beaten for missing the quota, blamed Moses for making their situation worse than before he arrived. What follows in the text is a sequence of 10 plagues, each directed at Egypt, and each one, according to the narrative, aimed at a natural force the Egyptians associated with one of their own gods. The Nile turned to blood, striking directly at Hapi, the god credited with the river's life-giving flood, and its fish died. Egyptian priests, practicing their own rituals, reproduced the sign on a smaller scale, and the king was not moved. Frogs overran the country, a challenge to Heket, a goddess linked to fertility and childbirth who was depicted with the head of a frog. Again, the king's own magicians managed to copy the effect. The dust of Egypt turned into biting gnats, and this time the magicians could not reproduce it. They told the king directly that they were looking at the work of a power beyond their own, but the king's position did not change. Swarms of flies filled Egyptian homes. Egyptian livestock died of disease while Israelite livestock were unaffected. Boils broke out on the skin of Egyptians and their animals. A hailstorm mixed with fire destroyed crops and struck down anyone caught outdoors. Locusts consumed whatever the hail had left standing. Darkness settled over Egypt for 3 days, a direct challenge to Ra, the sun god at the center of Egyptian religious life, described in the text as thick enough to feel. After each plague, the king would summon Moses, offer a partial concession, and then withdraw it once the plague had passed. Exodus repeats a specific phrase after nearly every one of these reversals. The king's heart was hardened, and he would not let the Israelites go. Before the 10th and final plague, Moses gave the Israelites specific instructions. Each household was to slaughter a lamb, mark the top and sides of its doorframe with the blood, and eat the meal indoors, dressed and ready to leave at once. That night, according to the text, every firstborn male in Egypt died, from the son of the king down to the firstborn of prisoners and livestock, while the households marked with lamb's blood were left untouched. The instructions given for that night became the foundation of Passover, observed by Jewish communities every year since. By morning, the king who had once ordered every Hebrew infant boy drowned in the Nile was mourning his own son, alongside the rest of Egypt. He summoned Moses and Aaron and told them to leave immediately, taking their flocks and herds with them. The Israelites left in haste. There was no time to let bread dough rise, so they carried it unleavened, a detail that also became part of the annual Passover observance. Exodus places the number of Israelite men who left at around 600,000, not counting women and children, alongside a mixed group of non-Israelites who left with them. A cloud is described leading them by day, and a pillar of fire by night. The king's change of heart did not last. Once the Israelites had gone, he and his officials reconsidered the loss of their labor force and set out after them with 600 chosen chariots, along with the remainder of Egypt's chariot corps. They caught up to the Israelites camped beside a body of water the Hebrew text calls Yam Suf, translated in most English Bibles as the Red Sea, though its exact location remains debated among historians and geographers. With Egyptian chariots closing in from behind and water blocking the way forward, Moses, according to the text, stretched his hand over the sea, and a wind drove the water back overnight, exposing dry ground with walls of water on either side. The Israelites crossed. The pursuing chariots followed them onto the same path, and as the last Israelites reached the far side, the waters returned, closing over the Egyptian force behind them. The text states that Pharaoh's army, his chariots and his horsemen, was destroyed in the water. Whether the king himself rode with the pursuing force, and whether he personally died there, is not stated outright in the Hebrew text, and later Jewish and Christian tradition has read the moment differently. Some versions have him present and destroyed with his army, others have him held back or spared to witness what happened to his men. On the far shore, Moses and his sister Miriam led the Israelites in a song commemorating the crossing, among the oldest passages preserved anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. The identity of this king remains one of the most contested questions in biblical archaeology, and it is worth explaining why. Two competing timelines have divided scholars for the better part of a century. The first relies on a note in the first book of Kings placing the Exodus 480 years before construction began on Solomon's temple, which would date the event to around 1446 BCE, during the reign of Thutmose III, or his son Amenhotep II. The second, favored by most secular archaeologists today, relies on the naming of the store city Rameses in Exodus along with other contextual details, and places the events during or shortly after the reign of Rameses II, sometime between 1270 and 1250 BCE, which would make his son and successor, Merneptah, the likely king in power when the Israelites actually departed. Complicating the later date is the Merneptah stele itself. If Israel was already a settled people in Canaan by 1208 BCE, that leaves a limited span of time for a group to have left Egypt, crossed the wilderness, and established itself in Canaan in time to appear on that inscription. Rameses II's own mummy, discovered in 1881, cannot settle the question either way. His lungs, the organ that would carry evidence of drowning, were removed during mummification, so the possibility can be neither confirmed nor excluded from the body itself. What is known from skeletal analysis is that Rameses lived to roughly 90 years of age, raising a separate and more practical question about whether a man that old would have personally led a chariot charge in pursuit of departing laborers, regardless of how the story concludes. The broader question of whether any of this happened as described is even more divided. The dominant position among modern biblical scholars and archaeologists is that the Exodus, as told in the Bible, is not historical in a literal sense. Excavation across the Sinai Peninsula has found no confirmed trace of a large population moving through it over an extended period, and the material culture of Israel's earliest highland settlements in Canaan closely resembles Canaanite culture rather than Egyptian. Many scholars who hold this position still allow for what is often called a historical core, a smaller group or several smaller groups of Semitic-speaking people who worked in Egypt, left the country under circumstances no longer recorded, and whose experience was later folded into a larger narrative describing the origin of an entire nation. Independent of the Bible, Egyptian and archaeological records do confirm that Semitic populations lived and worked in the eastern Nile Delta for centuries, and that Egypt made extensive use of foreign forced labor on its building projects. Some researchers have proposed natural explanations for individual plagues, such as an algae bloom turning the Nile reddish and toxic, setting off a chain of effects on fish, frogs, insects, and livestock. A separate Egyptian document, known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, describes a Nile turn to a blood-like state and a country in social collapse, and is sometimes cited as a possible parallel, though most Egyptologists date its composition several centuries before any proposed date for the Exodus, which weakens the comparison considerably. No single piece of evidence on either side of this debate has settled the question. Whatever its historical basis, the account of Moses confronting Pharaoh became one of the most repeated narratives in recorded history. Passover, instituted on the night of the final plague, has been observed annually by Jewish communities for thousands of years, with a specific instruction built into the ritual that each participant regard themselves as though they personally had left Egypt. Early Christian writers read the story typologically, treating the Israelites' bondage as a picture of bondage to sin, Moses as a forerunner of Christ, and the crossing of the sea as a symbol of deliverance through water. In 1776, when the newly independent American colonies debated a design for an official seal, Benjamin Franklin proposed an image of Moses parting the sea with Pharaoh's army behind him. The proposal was set aside, but the same comparison continued to appear in American political language for the following century, with George Washington described in sermons as a new Moses and king, George III cast as Pharaoh. Enslaved people in the American South drew the same comparison in the opposite direction, describing the northern United States as a promised land and their own escape as a personal exodus. Harriet Tubman, who guided dozens of enslaved people to freedom along hidden routes, was referred to by contemporaries as a Black Moses, and the spiritual Go-Down Moses, built around a repeated demand that Pharaoh let God's people go, became one of the defining songs of that era. Nearly a century later, Martin Luther King Jr. built the closing lines of the last speech he delivered before his assassination, around the image of Moses viewing the promised land from a distance he would not reach himself. The same narrative structure has been invoked by movements far outside the American context, from Afrikaner nationalists in southern Africa to Catholic liberation theologians organizing against authoritarian governments in 20th century Latin America. What connects nearly all of these later movements to the original account is the same detail: a ruler holding total, uncontested power, confronted by a form of resistance that never tried to match that power directly. Moses never commanded a battalion, never carried a weapon into the palace, and never won a battle in the conventional sense. What he did was return repeatedly to make the same demand to the same throne, until the damage caused by refusing became worse, by the king's own judgment, than the damage caused by giving in. Whether every plague, Every number and every name in the biblical account reflects a literal historical event, or whether a smaller, unrecorded departure grew over centuries into this specific telling. The underlying structure has outlasted the empire it describes by more than 3,000 years. Absolute power, reversed by something it had no army capable of stopping.